everyone, and welcome back to Advanced Java. In this video, I'm going to introduce the concept of properties and properties files, talk through that concept, and then spend a good deal of time actually going through a demo, which will set you up really well to work through the properties lab. So let's go ahead and get started. First, a little bit of background. So if you think about your analyzer project from Unit 1, some of you or many of you commented that it didn't feel quite right to be including some hard-coded values for things like author, email address, and that kind of stuff. And really, the reason that we have you do that in the first unit is so that it sets us up for a little bit of refactoring, and then we can introduce a better way of doing that. So this is that better way of an alternative to hard-coding those values. And that technique is to use properties files. So the idea here is that we're going to externalize that information and then load that up in our application. So we're going to get those details out of our source code. So let's take a look at a sample properties file. And it doesn't matter all that much where this came from or what exactly it's used for, but this is a real world properties file. First thing to notice here are the lines 1 through 20 begin with a hash. And so these are commented out lines. So a hash in a properties file is a comment. So lines 1 through 20 are essentially ignored when we read in a properties file, can provide more information about what the file actually does and what some of the values mean. Starting at line 21, then we have the real property key value pairs. So the left-hand side here, we've got, for example, session.invalidation interval, and then an equal sign, and then a value. So essentially what we're doing is creating a key or a variable here, and then assigning some value to it. So that shouldn't look like anything too special. We're used to doing that type of assignment in Java and in other languages. What this is going to allow us to do, though, is read this information in and very easily parse through and find a particular value that we need at any point in time. So one thing to note about properties files and the properties object that we'll be talking about here is that while we've already learned how to read in files, and we could certainly use a buffered reader to read in each line and then look for, say, the equal sign and get the value on the left-hand side, which is our key, and the value on our right-hand side, which is the actual corresponding value, there's a much easier way, and that's using the properties object. So there's more detail about properties in the reading smartly load your properties. So this isn't discussed in the text anywhere, so I've included an article here so you can learn more about that. So make sure that you include that reading along with the demo that I'm going to do here. So last thing that I want to do before we head into the code or the code demo is to search on properties Java 8. And what I want to do is take a look at the JDK or the Oracle documentation for this particular class. So one thing that you'll note if you look at kind of the hierarchy here, properties is ultimately a subclass of a dictionary. And you may be familiar with dictionaries from other classes. It's a special type of key value pair, and that's what we see represented here. We'll talk more about generics and how those things work, but essentially there's two pieces here, a key, which we saw the left-hand side of the equal sign, and the value, corresponding value on the right-hand side. A few methods that we'll be using are getProperty. So that allows us to get a value based on the key. So if I have, for example, a key value pair, say the key is author equals and then my name, by calling getProperty, passing in author, which is the key, I should get back then the value, which is going to be my name. So that will be one method that we see being used, and then loading. So we actually need to load up that file, right? And we're not going to use buffered reader for that. There's actually a load method that takes care of reading in that file and parsing through those key element pairs from that stream. So this is a much quicker way to process this than if we were to do that manually. So we'll be using the load method. And I'm going to leave it to you to take a look at some of the other methods. You'll be exploring some of these, particularly string property names and some others in the lab. So just be aware and remember that you can come back to this Java doc when you need it to learn more about what the different methods do. So let's go ahead and start with a demo and see how this works. So the first thing, I've started the demo here already. So I know many of you like to code along, so you've got a good working example. So you may want to just pause the video and kind of catch up with this boilerplate code. All I'm doing here is creating a main method, starting the demo, running, and then in this run method is where we'll actually do the work of instantiating a properties object, reading in that file or loading the properties, and then we'll display some of those properties back out to the console. So that's where we're headed. In terms of the import statements that we need, because we're doing some reading and writing, we of course need the IO package, and then the properties are part of the util package where our other collections are. So those are the two packages that we need to get started here. So go ahead, get caught up here, and then come back and we'll continue on with the demo. The next thing that we need to do is actually create the properties file that we're going to be reading. And the place that we're going to put the properties files for our projects is in the config directory. So we'll go ahead and just create a brand new file here. I'm going to call it demo-properties.properties. And that's a little long. I'm actually going to shorten this up just to demo. So demo properties. And I'm going to go ahead and add just a few key value pairs. So we'll have an author, since that's something that we know we're going to need at some point, and this will provide a good example for that. So author, we'll put my name in there, and then we'll add in, let's do email address as well. And we can use dot notation here to separate things out, and that tends to be, as we saw in the example, how properties are very often defined. So email address, and you can create whatever properties here you want. You can put junk in here, you can put real values in. It's totally up to you. Just have at least a couple keys with values. All right, and that goes in the config directory. So what we need to then do is make that config directory available to our class when our application is running. And the way that we're going to do that with our scripts. So on the demo script, I'm just going to add here to my class path config. And so that's adding in not only the demo's jar file where all of my classes live, but it's also adding in the config directory so that my code will know where to find that particular file. So make note that you'll need to make changes to your labs scripts as well as your analyzer, run analyzer script. So it'll be as simple as just adding in the .config here so that we add that to the class path. And I'll talk more about exactly what's going on there behind the scenes as we get coding, but this sets us up with the file we need and the script that we need. So let's go ahead now and start off by creating our properties object. And maybe before we really get going, we should make sure that our application is, at this point, this class is actually compiling. So I'm going to do that, make sure I'm not starting off with any errors and things look good there. All right, so let's go ahead and start off by instantiating a properties object. So here we'll have properties equals new properties. All right, so we've instantiated the class. The next thing is to load up the properties. And what loading the properties really means is reading in the file, the demo properties file, and that load process will essentially read the file, parse it based on those key value pairs, and put that stuff, make it available to us in this properties object. So it's a pretty simple one-liner to read in the file. And that really is loading up the key value pairs from the file. So let's see how we do that. So on the properties object, if you remember when we took a quick peek at the Java doc, there was a method called load. And to the load, we need to pass in the file that we want to load, but there's something special that we need to do in order to get that. And that is going to look a little bit clunky here as we get started, but as I talk through it, I think that will make sense. So on the class that we're on, so this is a method that's available on all classes. So this.getClass, get me the class that we're in, PropertiesDemo. And then there's a method there called getResource as stream. And to that, then I pass in the file name, and the file name needs to be prefaced with a slash. So keep that in mind. Very, very often this gets left off, and it's one of the most common probably mistakes in dealing with properties, and in particular this lab. So make sure you've got that guy on there. What's happening here is this getResourceAsStream method. What that will do is search the class loader, the class path essentially for this particular resource. And so this is just kind of boilerplate code that we can always use to load our properties. There's more discussion of why this technique is used over, say, reading in using buffered reader or something like that in the article that I referred you to earlier. So you can do a bit deeper dive there, but know that what this does is looks on the class path for the class that's currently running to find this particular file. And because we added, head back to the demos here, because we added the config directory to the class path, that's how our code, when it runs, will then be able to load up that particular file. All right, so coming back in here, finish that up with a semicolon. So we've instantiated our properties object. We're reading in the file, and then the next thing is let's display one of the properties out to the console. So I'm going to add a system.out.println here, and within that I'm just going to put a little header. So author property is, and then here is how we can get at that. So on the properties object, and we saw this when we took a quick peek at the JDK, there is a get property method, and to that method we need to pass the key, and that key in our case here was author. So that's, again, this left-hand side, author. All right, so let's go ahead and compile and see where we're at. So build failed. What's going on here? So this should look familiar from our demos on reading and writing and as we were learning exception handling. So here on line 29 of the properties demo, unreported exception, IO exception must be caught or declared to be thrown. So if you think about what's happening really behind the scenes with this property load and get resource as stream, what's happening is we're trying to read this file, right? Or the Java code's trying to read the file. And again, something can go wrong with that. So we need to handle that exception. If we just cut back over to the documentation here, as we were taking a look at or through the Java doc, if I take a look at our load properties, and here we're loading up that reader, if had we gone into this detail, we would have known that this load method is going to, or could throw an IO exception, that we're going to need to handle that. So that's not on the class itself, so we can't find that information here, but we instead need to inspect the different methods that we're calling, and it's there that we can discover, is this method going to throw an exception? Am I going to have to handle that? That said, if I didn't do that, if I didn't take a look at the Java doc ahead of time, the compiler is going to make me take care of this, right? So let's go ahead and add in our try-catch statement. So again, the line that had the problem was line 29, so that's going to be the line that I need to surround in my try-catch. So here, we're going to try to load up the properties, And the exception then that I need to catch is my IO exception. Oops. Sorry, I'm trying to remember the shortcut for the print line. So there we go, system.out.print line will put out a friendly message first. There was a problem reading the properties file. And we'll follow that with our stack trace. So IO exception, print stack trace. So we get the details of that. And then of course, if we're catching that exception, we also want to catch the general exception just in case something happens that doesn't fall into that particular bucket. And I'm going to leave this general here. There was some problem. And we'll print out the exception there. All right, let's see where we're at now, if we've satisfied the compiler or if I've made other typos that we need to clean up. Build successful. So let's go ahead and run. So we've got our run demos.sh. And I need to give it a class, of course, PropertiesDemo. And there we see the author property being written back out. All right, so the next thing that I want to do is display all of the properties to the console. So add a comment for that. And then let's just head back out to the JDK and take a look at what we have available for that. So what methods do we have here? Well, there's a method, string property names, returns sets of keys in this property list where the key and its corresponding values are strings. So with property files, we're dealing with strings. We're reading in a file, we're going to have string values on both sides of that equal sign. So that's an important thing to make note of. No other way really for us to get that information in if we're reading it out of that particular file. So string property names is going to be the method that we call, and what's that going to return to us? A set of strings. So let's go ahead and make that call and then loop through that set, displaying each of those properties. So here we'll create a set, and again that set is going to hold object references that point to strings. We'll call this property names. And so on our properties file, our properties object, there's a method called, and we just grab that out of there. Oops, I guess I didn't grab it. So string property names. Let's make sure things are compiling here. The build looks good, so we can continue on. Next thing to do, so here I'm not really displaying yet. Maybe what I'm doing is get all the properties, and then we'll actually display them. So display those properties. So because I've got a collection of strings, I can use a system.out.println just to dump those out. So here we'll have the set of property names, and to that I can just concatenate on the actual set. Again, because that collection just contains strings, this is an easy way to dump those out. So let's see what we've got at this point. And then we'll add on a little bit more here. So let's build, make sure we compile. Compile looks good. Let's give it a run. And so here we've got the original line that we wrote, and now the set of property names in our square brackets. So just very simply dumping out that set. So we see author and email address. So let's suppose now that I want to iterate through that set of names and get the value for each one. So now I'm going to display the key value pairs. which is the property name and its corresponding value. So I've got a collection of things that I want to loop over and do something with each one of those. So that means I'm going to want my for loop. And we can use the for each or the enhanced for loop. So what I'm getting out of that properties file is going to be the key, or out of the list of properties, right? I've got a set of strings. We'll call that the key. And the thing that I'm iterating over then is the property names. So for each one of those, we'll just display them to start off with. So the key is key. And I'm just going to add a blank line in here after that first dump of the properties so that we can kind of keep things separate here. Let's go ahead and compile. Build looks good. Let's run. All right, so we're writing out each of the keys individually now, and then let's add on to that the value. So I'm going to concatenate right in here. So the value is and on properties, there's a method getProperty. And to that, just like we did up here, I'm going to pass in the property that I want to get, and that we know is the key. And let's go ahead and compile that. That's looking good. And our run. So there we've got the key and then the value, and I'm just going to clean up a little bit of punctuation here. Hopefully make that a little bit easier to read. There we go. So the key is author, the value is my name, and then email address. All right, so you've got a nice working demonstration at this point of using properties. That sets you up to complete the properties lab. Couple things to remember. Number one, make sure that when you are passing in the name of the properties file in the lab that you've got a slash in here, /. Remember to add into your scripts, so for your labs and for Analyzer, you may as well do this all at the same time, add in that :config so that you are adding that config directory onto your class path. And then let's just bump over and take a look at that particular lab. Make sure we were set up for success on that one. So taking a look at the lab steps here, the overall idea is that you will be entering at the command line the name of the properties file that you want to read, and then your code will display all of the properties in that properties file, sort of like we just did. So we are iterating over getting each of the properties. The difference here with this lab is that at the command line, you'll be entering the name of the properties file to be read. So sort of setting you up for project 2 or for Analyzer part 2, where we'll be reading in a properties file from the command line. So that means we should be able to pass in any properties file and read it in this case. A little reminder here about adding the :config so that your code can actually find the properties files. All right, looks like you are all set to work on the lab. Please reach out if you have any questions. We'll see you next time.